And make sure to engage in comments and share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Inquisco for more real and true stories like this. The ranch was quiet that summer, too quiet in a way that made every sound sharper. The creak of a barn door in the breeze, the crunch of gravel under boots, the low hum of cicadas buzzing in the distance. Anna had lived here for years, long before her life got complicated, long before she became someone's wife, someone's stepmother. The land was her anchor, the rhythm of chores and sunsets grounding her in a way nothing else could. She thought she'd gotten used to how life could change in a heartbeat. And then Shawn came back. Shawn was her husband's son, but he wasn't much like his father. He was quieter, more watchful, the kind of man who seemed to see straight through the surface of things. He'd been away for college and then stayed in the city to work for a few years. Anna remembered him as a lanky teenager who barely spoke to her, still working through whatever resentment he carried about his father remarrying. But when he returned that summer, something was different. It wasn't just that he'd grown up. It was the way he carried himself now, self-assured but not cocky. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, his deep voice had a way of lingering in the air, commanding attention without effort. And there was something about the way he looked at her, steady, deliberate, almost as if he was trying to figure her out. Anna tried not to let it bother her. She was a married woman, after all, and Shawn was her stepson. But the way he lingered around the barn while she worked, offering to help fix this or carry that, made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, they were fixing a fence at the edge of the property. It was one of those blisteringly hot days where the sun seemed to melt everything it touched. Anna had tied her blonde hair back in a messy braid, her face slick with sweat as she wrestled with a stubborn post. Shawn was on the other side of the fence, his dark skin glistening under the sun as he drove nails into the wood. She caught herself staring once, her eyes tracing the muscles in his arms, the effortless strength in his movements. When he looked up, catching her gaze, she quickly turned back to her work, her cheeks burning. "You all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. "Yeah, just hot," she replied, avoiding his eyes. He handed her a bottle of water, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact sent a jolt through her, and she pulled her hand back too quickly, nearly dropping the bottle. Shawn chuckled softly, a sound that was both teasing and oddly intimate. "Careful now," he said, his eyes lingering on her just a second too long. Anna tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the task at hand, but the tension between them was undeniable, like a thread pulled tight, ready to snap. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild, but deep down, she knew it wasn't, and that scared her. That evening, as she stood at the sink washing dishes, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Shawn had looked at her, the way her body had betrayed her with that electric spark of attraction. She glanced out the window, where the last traces of sunlight painted the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Shawn was out there somewhere, probably in the barn or sitting on the porch, and the thought of him so close sent a shiver down her spine. When her husband walked into the kitchen, wrapping his arms around her waist, she stiffened. "You okay, Anna?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Yeah," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But it wasn't tiredness that kept her awake that night, staring at the ceiling as the house settled into silence. It was the way her heart raced whenever Shawn was near, the way her mind kept replaying those fleeting moments that felt too loaded, too charged to be innocent, and it was the growing sense of dread that she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't come back from. The days that followed became a test of Anna's resolve. She threw herself into the rhythm of ranch life, hoping the physical exhaustion would drown out the thoughts she refused to entertain. But Shawn was everywhere, helping with the cattle, repairing the tractor, even offering to drive into town for supplies. It wasn't that he was doing anything inappropriate. In fact, he was the perfect blend of polite and capable. And maybe that's what made it worse. Anna found herself hyper-aware of him. His laugh as he joked with the ranch hands, the way he leaned against the barn door in the afternoons, a faint smirk playing on his lips like he was in on some unspoken secret. Every glance he sent her way felt deliberate, as if he were testing the boundaries she was so desperately trying to maintain. She hated herself for noticing, but she couldn't help it. One evening, after her husband had gone into town for a meeting, Anna found herself alone in the kitchen. She was scrubbing the counters with a kind of frantic energy, trying to keep busy, when she heard the screen door creak open behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Shawn. The air shifted when he walked into a room, a presence that was impossible to ignore. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "No," she said quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she rinsed the sponge. "I'm just about done." But he didn't leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching her with that steady, unflinching gaze. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Anna felt her pulse quicken, her heart pounding in her chest like a warning. "You've been avoiding me," Shawn said finally, his tone neutral, but his words cutting straight through her defenses. "I haven't," she started, but the look on his face stopped her. He wasn't buying it, and deep down she knew he was right. "Look," she said, turning to face him. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it cracked under the weight of her own guilt. Whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not right." Shawn didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on hers, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of something, hurt, maybe, or disappointment. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that unreadable expression she was starting to recognize as his armor. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to mess things up for you." His words should have reassured her, but they didn't, because there was something in the way he said it, something that felt too close, too personal. She wanted to tell him to leave, to put distance between them, before they crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she found herself standing there, frozen, as Shawn took a step closer. He wasn't touching her. He was still a good foot away, but the space between them felt charged, like a storm, ready to break. Anna's breath caught in her throat, her body betraying her again, as she felt that same electric pull, stronger than ever. "Shawn," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not doing anything," he said, his lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't cocky or smug. It was gentle, almost teasing, but it sent a shiver down her spine all the same. "I'm just standing here." But the way he said it, the way his eyes never left hers, made it clear that they were both teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Anna's mind was screaming at her to stop this, to walk away, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor. She felt like she was drowning, caught in a current she didn't know how to fight. And then, just as quickly as the moment had built, Shawn stepped back. The spell was broken, and Anna felt the air rush back into her lungs as if she'd been holding her breath. "I'll see you in the morning," he said, his voice calm and even, as if nothing had happened. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Anna standing there, her hands trembling and her heart racing. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind, the way his voice had wrapped around her, the way his presence had filled the room like a shadow she couldn't escape. She hated herself for how much she'd wanted him to stay, for the part of her that had almost leaned into the storm instead of running from it. The next few days passed in a blur, each moment more unbearable than the last. Anna avoided Shawn like the plague, her stomach twisting every time she saw him from across the field or heard his voice drifting in from the barn. She threw herself into work with a desperate kind of energy, hoping the physical exhaustion would dull the gnawing ache in her chest. It didn't. The worst part was how little Shawn seemed affected. If he felt the same tension, the same unbearable pull, he didn't show it. He was polite, helpful, and infuriatingly calm, as if that moment in the kitchen had never happened. But every time their eyes met, it was there, the unspoken truth neither of them could deny. It felt like a game they were both playing, each waiting to see who would crack first. And then, one night, it happened. The house was quiet. Her husband was still out of town on a business trip, and the ranch hands had all turned in for the night. Anna was in the barn, finishing up some late-night chores she'd invented just to keep herself busy. The horses stirred restlessly in their stalls as a summer storm brewed outside, the air thick with the smell of rain. She didn't hear him come in. She only realized she wasn't alone when she turned and found Shawn standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the barn's hanging light. Her heart leapt into her throat, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You're working late," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, her words clipped as she turned back to the saddle she'd been cleaning. She focused on the task with a kind of frantic intensity, scrubbing at the worn leather as if her life depended on it. Shawn didn't move. He just stood there watching her, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her like a physical force. She could feel him, the heat of his presence filling the barn, making it impossible to think straight. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, echoing the words he'd spoken days ago. This time there was no amusement in his voice, just quiet conviction. "I'm not," she started, but her voice faltered. She couldn't lie to him, not when the truth was written all over her face. I don't know what you want from me, Shawn." He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the straw-covered floor. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just can't stop thinking about you." Anna froze, her breath catching in her throat. The barn seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in as the storm outside rumbled closer. She turned to face him, her hands trembling at her sides. "You can't say things like that," she whispered. "You can't—" "Why not?" he interrupted, his voice sharper now, laced with frustration. "Why can't I?" "It's the truth, Anna, and you feel it too." Her head spun, her body vibrating with a mixture of fear and longing. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Because he wasn't wrong. She did feel it. She felt it every time he looked at her, every time his voice sent shivers down her spine. "This has to stop," she said, her voice breaking. "We can't—" But Shawn wasn't listening. He took another step toward her, closing the distance between them until he was close enough for her to feel the heat radiating off his skin, close enough to see the way his dark eyes burned with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said, his voice low and rough. "Look me in the eye and tell me you don't." Anna opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst, her body trembling with the effort to hold herself together. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control. "Shawn, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't do this." For a moment, she thought he might listen. His jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides as he fought some internal battle she couldn't see. But then, just as quickly, he stepped back. The tension snapped like a rubber band, leaving the air between them heavy and electric. Shawn ran a hand through his hair, his breathing ragged as he looked at her with a mixture of frustration and something else. Something softer, almost tender. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't mean to." But before he could finish, a sharp clap of thunder shook the barn, making them both jump. The moment was broken, and Anna seized the chance to put distance between them. She brushed past him, her heart racing as she fled into the night. The rain had started to fall, cool droplets soaking her skin as she stumbled toward the house. She didn't look back, didn't dare risk seeing the look on Shawn's face. All she knew was that she had to get away, to put as much space between them as possible before she did something she could never take back. As she reached the porch, the storm surged overhead, lightning splitting the sky in brilliant flashes. She paused, her chest heaving as she stared out into the darkness. She thought of Shawn, standing alone in the barn, and felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or relief, or both. But as the rain poured down around her, she realized one thing with painful clarity. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Inquisco for more real and true stories like this.